Imagine a headphone amp and a speaker amp that's so good that it's used around the world by music mixing, mastering and recording professionals as a reference tool for making the music that we all love to listen to, used in places like Abbey Road studios. And then imagine if that amp was smaller than many CD players or transports, able to fit on a desk in roughly the same space as an A5 sheet of paper would take up. And then imagine that you could have one too. Because you can. The amp I'm talking about is the Chord Alto, and it's a product that many of us in consumer audio will never have heard of because it's designed for the pro market. Those of you that have heard of it before might have dismissed it due to its price and its size. You might have dismissed its price because at first it looks expensive at $4,320 US, and then when you add that to its size, it looks too small to be really special. Indeed, when I first tried out the Chord Alto, my expectations weren't particularly high. I love Chord's digital gear, but I have no experience with their amps. I really liked what I saw of the design of the Alto, but my expectations were for an amp that was solid rather than exceptional. And that's because my experience with pro audio gear has left me with the understanding that it's more often built for practicality than for absolute sound quality. For example, the pro-grade products from brands like RME and Benchmark have left me cold. That was my expectation from the Alto too. And when I swapped from using the Burson Timekeeper GT monoblocks that I've been using as my speaker amps lately, over to driving the same speakers with the Chord Alto, my relatively low expectations were realised. The Timekeepers had it all over the Chord Alto. The Timekeepers offered better separation of sounds, better clarity, and a better sense of control over the drivers and the speakers. However, the Timekeepers also cost about the same as the Alto, and they're just a pair of mono power amps. They don't have a volume control, they definitely can't amplify your headphones, and they can't be a preamp. They're also about 3 to 4 times the size of the Alto when you consider a stack of the Timekeeper monoblocks versus just a single Alto unit. I figured I probably had to rethink things just a little bit. The Alto is designed to be a near-field monitor amplifier and also a studio-grade headphone amplifier. It's not intended to compete with large, high-power monoblock amplifiers that cost the same amount as the Alto but just do one thing. As such, the Alto puts out a relatively modest 25 watts into an 8 ohm pair of speakers. Keep in mind though that in most near-field listening setups, the speakers are about only 1 meter away from you, and that means you'll generally be able to produce 80 decibels of sound with 1 watt or even less. Which is to say that 25 watts into 8 ohms or 50 watts into 4 ohms as it is with the Alto, that's going to be plenty in a near-field setup. That is, unless you're trying to go deaf. And then all of that power is also available for your headphones too. I say all of that power, maybe not quite all of it, but the Alto will put out 2.25 watts into 100 ohm headphones. That means it's going to drive any headphone on the market. In addition to having very powerful outputs, the Alto has a few other tricks up its sleeve as well. The amplification circuit uses feed-forward technology to remove any kinds of unwanted noise or distortion from the signal, and that's going to result theoretically in a very clean and perfectly accurate output. It also comes with a high-frequency switch mode power supply in the form of an inline power brick, and the idea of that is that it pushes any switching noise from the power supply well outside the audible bandwidth of noise. That all keeps the Alto itself very small without sacrificing sound quality. And then we get to the inputs and outputs. On the surface, they're pretty normal. On the back, you've got RCA and XLR inputs, and you've got a pair of XLR outputs, as well as of course some receptacles for the pins on the end of speaker cables. Turning around to the front, we've got a 4.4mm connector, a 3.5mm connector, and a pair of 6.3mm connectors. All 4 of those can be used simultaneously if you want to, and that can be really handy if you want to A/B some headphones or listen to an audio mix across a couple of different headphones with very different tunings perhaps. But as a side note, I should mention the 4.4mm socket is not a truly balanced socket because the Alto is not a fully balanced amplifier. I know some of you are immediately going to think that that makes it useless and not as good as the competition, but that'd be a mistake to write this off over the fact that the 4.4mm socket isn't truly balanced. And with that little teaser just hanging there, this would be a really good time while we're talking about using multiple headphones for a short message from the sponsor of this video. This video is sponsored by Deconi Audio, makers of headphone pads, ear tips, a fantastic modular cable system, and even things like headphone carry cases. Visit deconiaudio.com and use the code PassionForSound10 for 10% off any purchases of all their range of products. We've talked about all of the relatively normal inputs and outputs of the Alto, but where it takes things a little bit further is in the ways that you can select what the Alto is doing. There are a myriad of ways to set up the use of the different inputs and outputs here. You can have the output of the amp go to the headphones. You can have the output of the amp go to the speakers, or you could have the output go to the XLR outputs for preamp control of, say, active monitors. But then the XLRs can also be used in a direct pass-through mode, with either the incoming RCA or the incoming XLR signal being sent straight out through the XLR without being touched by the amp. In other words, no volume control, just a direct pass-through. On top of that, you could also have the headphone outputs active at the same time as having the XLR outputs active, or having the speaker outputs active. If you wanted for some reason to have headphones running at the same time as speakers, the Alto can also do that too. The point is, it's all switchable and entirely in your control. Every possible configuration that you can think of, the Alto can do it. What's more, the sound of the relays when you change the outputs is So this is all nice in theory, but remember before that I started off with the Alto and then went to the Burson monoblock Timekeeper amps and was moderately underwhelmed. It was time now for a more realistic comparison. The drawcard of the Alto is all about providing a compact single box solution. I don't have anything comparable to the Alto as a headphone amp, preamp and speaker amp, but I do have some amazing headphone amps and preamps here. And so first up in the comparisons is the LAiV HP2A headphone amp and preamp. This is a brilliant device at $2,700 US, and it's roughly the same size as the Alto. It is a little bit bigger and it doesn't have any speaker amplification capabilities, but at $2,700 US, it seemed like a reasonable comparison point to get us started. For testing, I ran the Volumio Revo Plus streamer with the Volumio Lineo 5 power supply, and that was feeding from the AES output via a Supra Digital Excalibur XLR cable into the Gishelli Labs Daisy DAC, and then I had two pairs of Ri-Cable Invictus XLRs going into the Alto and also into the LAiV HP2A. Most of my testing then was done with the Focal Utopia headphones. And the first thing to hit me about the Alto was its outstanding sense of clarity and separation. It's a very different presentation compared to the HP2A, and it's immediately more detail focused than the relatively smoother and richer sounding HP2A. The Alto is simply incredible when it comes to detail retrieval, texture, resolution, whatever word you want to put to it. Of course, the HP2A does still sound wonderful, and some people will prefer its slightly richer, smoother sound. It's going to feel a bit more laid back and a bit more easygoing to some people. But to me, the Alto was immediately more impressive. It throws a wider soundstage than the HP2A, and the separation of individual sounds is clearly superior. As I tried more tracks and more headphones, I can see, as I've already said, some people leaning towards the HP2A on certain headphones and certain tracks. It's going to help with a more aggressive headphone to make it a little bit more of a relaxed listen, and the same is true if it's a harsher recorded track. But that said, the sense of control and precision from the Alto is undeniably impressive. This, the Chord Alto, is easily one of the very best headphones I have ever heard. It was so impressive that I couldn't resist comparing it to the much more expensive but kind of similar Enleum AMP-23R. The Enleum is also a speaker amp and headphone amp, but it's not really designed for studio use. The Enleum AMP-23R costs about $2,000 US more than the Chord Alto, and you do hear it when you compare these two. The Enleum has an edge in its sense of realism delivered to the music, and also with the sense of ambience and space within the soundstage and around each sound. There's an overall sense of ambience to the Enleum AMP-23R that the Alto can't quite match. However, the Alto is absolutely matching the Enleum for its sense of detail and clarity. It's really only falling short because the Enleum just has that touch more sense of realism. It's a little tiny bit more lifelike. The Alto doesn't quite make you feel like you're in the audience in the same way that the Enleum can. And the same is generally true when you use both the speaker amps as well. The AMP-23R is clearly better, but the Alto is insanely impressive for its price and its size. At this point in my testing, I felt like the Alto clearly and easily justified its price tag as a headphone amp, but I wasn't sure yet if it did the same as a speaker amp. The next test was to use the Alto as a speaker amp, driving my ProAC Response D2R speakers. And for comparison, I continued using the LAiV HP2A headphone amp and preamp, but I fed the outputs from the HP2A into a pair of SMSL PA-X amplifiers running in mono mode. Together, the HP2A with the pair of PA-X speakers comes in at just over $4,000, so it's a pretty good total comparison price to go head to head with the Alto. Of course, I'll be doing a full review of the PA-X speaker amps, both in stereo mode and mono mode. That's coming soon, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see that one. And while we're talking speaker amps, and in this case mono amps, if you're wondering why I didn't use LAiV's GAN M amplifiers for this, it's because they just cost too much to be a fair comparison with the Alto. But I do have a pair of those here soon. That's another review coming soon, and a second reason you're going to want to subscribe. My first impressions of the speaker setup comparison was that the SMSL PA-X amps with the LAiV HP2A was getting to be about the same performance level as the Chord Alto. And that's not a bad thing given the similarities in pricing between the two setups. The Alto still won on convenience, of course, because it's a single box, compared to 3 different boxes with the HP2A and the 2 PA-X amps. However, longer listening showed me a few problems. Problems with my first impressions. The dual mono PA-X setup produced a slightly wider soundstage than the Alto amplifier did, but the Alto focuses the image more tightly and each individual sound within the soundstage more tightly. The sound was more holographic and more lifelike from the Alto compared to the HP2A with the pair of PA-X amps. As I switched back and forth over and over, the Alto was consistently the setup that I preferred listening to. It was engaging, lifelike, dynamic, and exciting. Nothing was enhanced, but the sound was just so realistic that it was drawing me much more into the music than I could get from the HP2A and SMSL stack. And so to summarize everything that I've learned through this journey, I think the Chord Alto's absolute biggest strength is its headphone amp performance. That's where it shines the brightest. The speaker amp performance is great though. It's not leaps and bounds ahead of an equivalently priced setup of separates, but it is still ahead, and it's a much simpler and more compact system, and you're not having to worry about extra cables and boxes. For that reason, I think the Chord Alto is an incredibly good option for anybody looking for a desktop-style headphone and speaker amp system. And of course, the preamp outputs from the Alto are equally as impressive as the headphone outputs, so if you're into using active monitors, the Alto gets even better there. Basically, everything I've said about the wonderful headphone stage continues if you've got a pair of active monitors connected to the rear outputs. In case you're wondering about the Alto as a pure headphone amp, if you're not going to use speakers in other words, I still think it stacks up for its price because it's the best headphone amp I've heard underneath the AMP-23R, which is more expensive, and also the Burson Soloist Voyager, which is probably a little bit more expensive as I've got it set up here, and it does pull ahead a bit. And so I do think it's worth considering even if you're just after a headphone amp. Its sense of resolution, clarity, and imaging is nothing short of exceptional. And on top of that, it's insanely powerful for its size and price. Of course, if you want something even better still, then I've pinned a video here for you to watch next about what I still consider to be the best speaker amp and headphone amp that I've ever heard. So check that video out next, but for now, a thank you to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.